Assalamu alaikum and welcome to CaliforniaCare. Today we are going to talk about crown preps, anterior and posterior, and we'll start out with the armamentarium used for it. Armamentarium necessarily is essentially the burrs. Everybody knows about the handpieces and the mirror and the explorers that you need for evaluation and for visualization or for retraction of the soft tissue. So we'll focus currently on which burrs to use and what level of prep and how. Here's an example of a tooth we drew. You're looking at it from the facial. Preferably it's like a lower molar. Our goal is currently, notwithstanding gold restorations, majority of the restorations being done are either PFM or hopefully more zirconias. We are looking for a shoulder bevel. We're going to talk a little bit later about how the shoulder bevel should be. Should it come out at 90 degrees or should it come out at more obtuse angle to the surface? As you go further down onto the tooth, here if I were to place a margin, because of the enamel rods, hypothetically if I were to place a margin here, this is the orientation of the enamel rods, so the margin should be like that. Okay. If you make the margin less, then you have unsupported enamel. If you make the margin at this point like that, all of these rods would be unsupported. So you have to exit the margin onto the tooth structure, at least according to the enamel rods, or a little bit more obtuse. So what I'm trying to say is that, let's say the enamel rods are coming this way. Do not make the margin like that. If you want to make the margin, you can make the margin as such with exaggerated obtuse angle. What this would do, it would remove all of these enamel rods, and what enamel rods are left here are still supported. So you can always err towards an obtuse angle. Keeping that principle in mind, I like to make all my angles slightly obtuse, not at 90 degree out, but sloping downwards. This also helps in cementation, and when you're cementing the crown down, the crown does not have to sit exactly at the edge. It could slide in and give you better seal at the tip if the angle, emergence angle of the margin is obtuse. So obtuse is a better angle to have. In order to get this inside form, we need to use a burr that matches the shape. So we have selected a shoulder prep or shoulder tip type of burr. The parts of the burr would be that you would have a shank up there, right here, and then you would have the diamond coated tip, and the tip of it would look something like such. This is the exaggerated blown up response to the tip. Compare that to a chamfer tip. Chamfer tips are normally rounded. The chamfer would be needed if you are doing a crown prep to finish it in metal margin or in gold. But when you are doing it with a chamfer tip, you can only go half the tip to utilize. Otherwise, what you get at the margin would be something like this, and this part would be the ski jump and be not only unsupported enamel. If it is into cementum or dentin, then this hook would break off regardless, and it would prevent the seating of the crown. So if you were to do inside nice and rounded margin, you can use a chamfer, but you still would need to finish the outside either with a hand instrument or with a shoulder prep burr. So take the internal rounded edge and then exit flat to ensure that you do not have any unsupported enamel or a hook at the end called ski jump. Having said that, we come back to the diamond. The diamond itself would have taper, and this is the built-in taper that you do need for the retention. If these two walls have undercuts, of course you would not be able to seat the crown down, but if they are convergent with few degrees, 6 to 12 degrees, then you have good resistance to unlodging. Good retention would be built into the crown prep. When you have the features in a crown prep, if this is a crown and you're looking at it from the occlusion, if you do the crown prep and you have the mesial dip in the margin, because that's how the root is normally, if you have the mesial dip, you have the distal slide dip, and if you have interradicular dips on the lingual, interradicular dip on the facial, then you have resistance to rotation. But if you have the parallelism in the wall with very little bit of convergence, then you also have resistance added to the crown, so it won't slide off and it won't slip off. But coming back to the exact margin and the burr, the taper is built into the burr. So if you were to hold the burr parallel to the long axis of the tooth all around, you should be able to get that taper built in your prep because of the burr being straight and with the built-in tapers into it. So I suggest do not buy a burr which is 100% straight, a perfect straight cylinder. Do not buy that. Always buy a tapering burr and diamond coat it. Now if you come to this side, I have made a little list of what kind of burrs are available. You have extra coarse burrs, and they rapidly reduce the enamel or the tooth structure because they're extra coarse. Then you have a little less coarse, which are just called coarse. Then you have medium, fine, and extra fine. All of these have actually to do with the particle size of the diamond particles that are attached to the burr surface, and that is how the cutting happens. Extra fine could be there if you're doing a very fine, smooth prep to show in an examination. But to me, practically coarse or extra coarse would be best because they would leave the surface rather rough. And when it comes to cementation, in my opinion, they would allow for that roughness for the cement to engage into. Now, having said that, if you have the roughness and you have covered it with a temporary crown on the preparation, then invariably some cement from the temporary cementation process will stick to the tooth. So you must clean that off, and you can use piezo to clean it off. If you have left the tooth unprotected in the mouth with our temporary crown, definitely know that not only plaque would form, but also tartar would start forming. From periodontics books, we do remember that it only takes 24 hours for plaque to start mineralizing into hard tartar over 24-hour period of time. So the coarseness would be a counter effect to you, and you would need to clean the tooth surface very thoroughly before cementation. For zirconia cementation, we do need to treat the tooth very well, clean it mechanically, physically. Then we also have to etch it and apply the adhesive layer to get the zirconia to adhere. But I would take the same precaution and same efforts in preparing the tooth for cementation when a PFM is involved. I would clean it with piezo. I would go ahead and also use hydrogen peroxide gauze, not too wet, slightly moistened, to clean the surface of the tooth to remove any buildup on it. The reason I would not use alcohol on the tooth is because alcohol is known to fix proteins onto the surface where you're cleaning it. So all the salivary proteins, particularly the phospholipids, would get stuck to the tooth surface. Now these phospholipids would be inhibitive when it comes to zirconia crown preparations and cementation. Remember, zirconia has very, very strong affinity for phosphates, and our saliva has phospholipids. So if the zirconia crown is tried out in the mouth and it gets contaminated with saliva, the inside of the zirconia crown would stick all the phosphates and phospholipids, and less adhesion would be achieved. To counter that effect, you would need to etch the inside with hydrofluoric acid, not phosphoric acid. Phosphoric acid is the one we use regularly for etching the tooth structure when it comes to doing composites. Phosphoric acid has phosphates in it. So if you were to use regular phosphoric acid inside a zirconia crown, then actually you are coating the inside with phosphates. So you cannot use that. You have to use hydrofluoric acid to clean the inside of the zirconia crown. And of course you follow that. So coming back to the crown prep, the tooth must be very clean, thoroughly clean, possibly chemically clean. And if it has been exposed to the mouth too long and you see tartar buildup, even visual, I would pick up a burr and roughen the surface again. Similar kind of burr, maybe not extra coarse, maybe medium, to get the roughness in there. And then you can have a better adhesion of cement to the tooth structure. The margins have to be very even and smooth all around the crown. You can rise with the CJ on distal and mesial, as it normally happens in the mouth, or you can keep them flat, but nonetheless there should be no sharp ups and downs in a crown margin. The evenness in the width or the depth of the margin has to be also maintained. The tip itself on these burrs could vary anywhere from 0.5 millimeter to 3/4, which is 0.75 mm. So depending on what kind of margins you want, if you sink the whole depth of the burr to the tip, you'll get even margins all around, and you don't have to measure everywhere. One of the worst things that happens, and I see that happen in the boards or examination, is when you're prepping the margin interproximally, you end up nicking or cutting the adjacent tooth. Now that's an automatic failure for all the boards that I do know, or all the bench exams everywhere. And even clinically, you do not want to end up cutting the adjacent tooth. What people don't realize is when you do put the diamond burr inside, this is the width of the diamond burr. And if you're cutting interproximally, even at a slight angle, you should have a sliver of enamel still left between the tooth you're cutting and the adjacent tooth. The mistake happens when people start cutting right here and they think that's where the margin is going to be. And as they're cutting here, they end up nicking the adjacent tooth. My cue for that is you prepare the facial margin completely, and from facial you keep the same margin depth, you start going interproximal. And not high up occlusally, but from gingival point of view. And if you start cutting at the gingival level to continue the facial margin into distal sulcus or the mesial sulcus, you will be able to do a nice prep without nicking the adjacent tooth, and you will start seeing that there's a sliver or a piece of enamel still left beyond the width of your burr, even at the widest point. That's the way to save that. So here'll be a representation of it. If this is the burr, you do it like that, and you go from facial all the way to the lingual, and the adjacent tooth will be safe. Preparations, like I said, I would do the facial separately, I would do the lingual separately, then I would connect the facial on the distal to the lingual and on the mesial to the lingual. By this time you have a nice prep all around with convergence in the walls, nice smooth margins, and the only thing that remains is the occlusion. I like to do occlusion first. To me it is kind of like building a building. I would have the foundation first, which is the margins. Then I would have the walls as a second thing, and then I would put my occlusion on the walls. So once I have done, like I said, I repeat it, I do the facial and the linguals, then the interproximal, and once the occlusion is left, I would take the central groove and I would take a burr like this. This is a nice acorn type of burr, and as we're showing you the close-up of it, this is the outline of the burr. It is pointed, it's like a spinner. Beyblade is what kids used to play with about 10 years ago. It has the same tip, rotating tip, and you can use that to cut very nice groove in the center, and it would give you both of these slopes very easily. Then you can use the same burr that we were using for the margin prep to do the sides like this and blend everything in. Or you can use this same burr which was used for the margins, and you can cut one cusp and then the second cusp to make the central groove. But with this, I get very nice central groove and a very nice flare all around. And doing this step ensures that when the crown is made, particularly in PFM, there is enough thickness on the occlusion for them to make the central grooves. In the beginning, it used to be hard for me to do this concept. So what I started doing in the beginning was I would take a regular composite or amalgam prep burr, and I would do a class 1 preparation on the occlusion in the central groove. So if this was a tooth and it has grooves like this, I would do a class 1 prep like this all around. Then I would connect the cusp to that. But once I found this burr, it was kind of nice, and now I can go ahead and sink that in and get my required depth. At the functional areas, the required depth could be 2 millimeters. At the non-functional, it could be 1.5. I'm writing upside down, so I do not know if the numbers show right. But wherever you are, if you're unsure about the depth, then go ahead and use a regular diamond or carbide burr that you use for your class 1 restorations, and do the class 1 preparation, and that way you'll know exactly how deep you are in the central groove, so the ambiguity is removed and you'll have a surety into the crown prep. And then you go ahead and connect those 2 points together, and you should get very nice depth on the occlusion in the central fossa. And when the lab goes to make the crowns, they can put 0.5 millimeter or 0.4 millimeter of metal. Then they can put the opaque layer up on top and the rest of the porcelain. But even in the porcelain, I want them to go put the grooves so we can have good anatomy and the staining in there. Now here we have an example of an interior tooth. It could be upper or lower. Of course, if it was upper tooth, then functional surface would be on the palatal side. And if it was a lower tooth, the functional area would be incisal-facial aspect. So this would be the functional area. And on the lower tooth, then generally this upper tooth maxilla, this would be the functional area, because that's where the lower tooth would come in and interact with the upper one. And that is where you would need to have the thickness of the metal or the contacts. And in the lower tooth, depending on the overbite normally the incisal edge and the incisal facial half or third is the functional area. So I'm going to erase that now. In order to do the prep of incisor or a canine would have to have multiple surfaces on the facial. So this is where the margin is being started. The first facet would be right here. Then the second aspect would be right there. And the third aspect would be right here. So it has to be prepped in 3 aspects. And again, the best burr would be just like the posterior burr that we were using, a straight tip or a shoulder tip, chamfer burr with converging walls as it goes towards the dip. That would give you the right convergence when it comes to prep interproximally. On the lingual, it's a little complicated because you're no longer dealing with only convex surfaces. So here you would start out the prep like this with the same shoulder prep burr. Here you can also do the same thing with the shoulder prep burr, but this concavity and then slight convexity poses a problem. So solution I have found is this burr that you see here on your right side. This is the outline shape. It's kind of like a balloon or like a ball, and it is made of diamond. You can have again the same consistencies as extra coarse, coarse, medium, fine, or extra fine. I like to use coarse and occasionally extra coarse, and this works good for me. I would use that burr and I would create in one sweep a nice round curvature on the lingual aspect. This works great, and I would even extend it all the way to the incisor, and the only area I would leave it would be this area right here, and I would finish that with my shoulder prep burr, and that's how you get the crown prep done right. When you look at the facial aspect of it, I follow the same principle. I would do the margin first on the facial, then I would do the lingual, and interproximally I would connect them together, and this would leave a sliver of the tooth structure against the adjacent. And as you're doing this prep right here, the adjacent area remains prepped, and this will be the final prep. This is the shape of the burr, and this area is the tooth structure that remains between the tooth you're prepping and the adjacent tooth. There is no reason, if you were to use this technique, for you to end up nicking the adjacent tooth. And remember, clinically it's a failure, it's a damage to the adjacent tooth, and you're professionally liable for that. It's malpractice to nick the adjacent tooth. Please don't nick the adjacent tooth. I have seen many crowns where I had to redo the crown. When I took the crown off, I saw a large decay of the adjacent tooth, and I could see the flat interproximal contact because somebody just cut through the contact when they were prepping the tooth that we are repairing. Or a crown is done, then the adjacent teeth develop class 2 restorations, interproximal cavities. Once I remove them or I start cleaning them up, or on the radiograph I also see that the adjacent tooth structure has been totally cut as they were prepping the tooth that has a crown on. Following this technique, you do the facial margin, you do the lingual margin, and then you just connect the facial to the lingual at the margin depth here at the gingival level. Do not start from the incisal or the occlusion, and you take the burr straight through, and you'll end up saving a little bit of tooth structure of the tooth you're prepping, let alone trimming the adjacent tooth. The adjacent tooth will be very nicely saved, and you will not end up nicking it. To finish the margins, here is a long shank burr. It's fairly long at the shank right here. There's no diamond attached to the whole shank anywhere. At the tip you also have 2 bevels, so the tip becomes thinner, and at the tip is where the diamond particles are, and they're fine diamond particles, not coarse. I utilize this occasionally to really finely smooth the margin on a preparation, like in this area. So I would be just smoothing this marginal area right here, the bevel itself, the margin all around. I would use this burr and smooth it really nice. Since it does not have any diamond or any cutting edges on the side, it cannot nick the adjacent tooth. So if you're putting an extra bevel right here, so let's say you took the margin further down and supposedly you're putting an excessive bevel, interproximally particularly, so the angle of the shaft would come out like this and it might touch the adjacent tooth right here. But since this burr does not have any cutting surface, any diamond or any carbide cutting area on the shank, it would just burnish the adjacent tooth without cutting it. The only active surface is at the tip. So you can try to find, if you want, margin polishing burr, and that would take the margins to a different level for you. Thank you. Alright, so here we have an example of a class 1 inlay. What I want you to realize is from the lingual, the preparations have to be normally straight with the dip intercuspal right down the middle of the tooth towards the lingual. The dovetails, this is the straight part of the dovetail, and the part that extends out is called the dovetail right here. The dovetail wall on the side has to be parallel to the marginal ridge. This wall has to be parallel to the marginal ridge, but this wall is divergent compared to that wall. This wall angulation has to do with the interproximal angulation of the tooth. So that wall from inside out would be the same angle as the emergence profile of the tooth. And here you have it. Everything is divergent from inside out. You should be able to see the internal lines as well as the external lines simultaneously, and that is the only time you'll be able to do a wax pattern or an indirect restoration and be able to cement it. Now we'll take this and change it into a class 2 by going into interproximal either on the distal aspect or the mesial aspect. Distal aspect I'll get later, because on this specimen we have a fracture into the enamel, and if I were to make it, the box would become extra wide like this. So I'll do that as an MOD, but first I'll start out with the mesial occlusion. For mesial occlusion, I'm going to take this lingual aspect, bring it straight out, and the facial aspect where the dovetail started, I'll bring it to a reverse curve from this line, and this is called reverse curve, and bring it down. If you were to do a direct restoration, then the inside of the box would be wider. If you're doing an indirect restoration, then the bottom has to be convergent, so you can lift in and out whatever you're preparing there. Okay, so here we have the preparation. Occlusally is all prep for inlay. Interproximally, the walls are totally parallel to each other, and that would be not conducive to an inlay. The walls have to be divergent as they go from gingival to occlusion. Another feature that I've added here is a retention to show you how a direct restoration would need to be restored with the retention. What you have to realize is when you look at it from occlusal, the wall is parallel to the outside surface of the tooth. The wall goes inside and the retention is into the dentin, then there is some dentin, and then you have enamel rods up on top left. Okay. Do not put the retention into the enamel rods would be unsupported and then they'll break off. The retention has to be into the dentin. And the retention Burr angulation is not like this, but it goes sideways into the facial and sideways into the lingual aspect. So this is the retentive feature right there. The Burr disappears into the dentin. Here also the Burr disappears into the dentin, and that's where the retention comes in. For me to convert it into an inlay or an onlay, then I'm going to go ahead and make the walls divergent as they come occlusally. That means this space right here has to be wider than this space right here, and the angulation has to be in line with the walls right here. I will leave the bevel right there. That will help in cementation later, and this margin has to be sloping apically as it exits the cable surface. So I'll go ahead and make those modifications, then show you as an inlay. Then we'll convert it into an MOD inlay, then we'll convert it into an onlay, then we'll convert it into a 3/4 crown, then a 7/8 crown. 7/8 crown would involve the distal aspect and leave the mesial facial aspect of the crown of the tooth intact. Then we'll convert it into a full crown. Okay, so here in an MOD inlay, we are not covering any cusps. Hence, it's an inlay. It only covers the spaces between the two cusps on the facial and the lingual, or 4 cusps. Compared to one-sided inlay, two-sided inlays involve parallelism or convergence against opposite walls. These walls have to be divergent against each other. These walls inside have to be convergent with each other, not divergent. These two walls have to be convergent to each other. These two walls have to be divergent. The boxes also have to be divergent from the bottom up. Not only that, the two boxes, the distal box and the mesial box, have to be co-divergent. That means this line at this angle should match that angle. This angle should match that angle. So an inlay, once it's casted a solid piece can be driven inside without creating any undue stress on any of the walls. And these have to be convergent. So the only two walls that are convergent in an inlay are these two walls. So if you come across a question that says all the internal walls of an inlay have to be divergent, that's the wrong answer. All the walls have to be divergent except the two walls that are in the box opposite of each other. They have to be convergent. Now we will take this and change it into an onlay. According to the internet and some of the pictures in circulation, the onlay to them is if you take an inlay and just put a bevel on the occlusal surface without covering a cusp completely. To them that's an onlay. So I have done that by making the bevel, but what was taught to me as an onlay 30 years ago covers cusp. So I'll go ahead and now convert this to what they call an overlay, which was taught to me as an onlay, but nonetheless these are progressive steps in preparation. Okay, so here we are looking at a couple of preps. The one on the lingual has a very sharp angle, and that would suffice when it comes to a metal crown like a gold or some other alloy, but it would not suffice if you're doing any porcelain work up on top or zirconia. For that you need a definite shoulder. So here on the facial and the functional aspect of this tooth, I have put like a crown margin, but within about a couple of millimeters of the prepared cusp tip. So 1 millimeter of the cusp tip height and 1 millimeter of wall, and that's where the margin goes. So if I were to do a metal one compared to a porcelain or ceramic or zirconia one, I would do this kind of prep also on the lingual, so I'm going to modify it. A second modification comes in if there's a buccal pit, then you want to dip down into the buccal pit also. Here we're not doing that because later on I want to use this tooth for a partial coverage crown, but this is the difference that you're looking at. So now I'm going to modify the lingual also to allow for non-metallic restoration. So on this preparation what we have is each cusp has at least 4 facets from the cusp tip, 1, 2, 3, 4. Then on the facial it has 2 facets, and in the lingual aspect it also has 2 facets into the box. So it turns out to be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, at least 8 facets each, that's 16. Plus on the distal you have 2, then you have the boxes. So 16 facets on the lingual 2 cusp and 16 on the facial 2 cusp. You have 32 facets total that you're supposed to recreate. Plus then you have the margin, which is even all around, and the margin must continue into the box in order to gain the full strength. So this as full strength will be tied together, and upon occlusion loads the margins won't deflect to open up from here or there. So if I were to even do gold onlay, I would still do these margins. It would give structural strength like pillars to the margins, and upon occlusion loads the margins would not open up. Now we will take this and change it into a 3/4 crown. In 3/4 crown I would cover this aspect completely, and the facial would be kept clean. And this used to be a technique used when we had no ceramics to cover the tooth with, and the restorations we had available were metal restorations. And to keep the buccal surface clean in the smile, we would cover the lingual as a 3/4 or 75% of the tooth was covered with it, and 25% of the tooth was remaining. In 7/8 crown you would also get the distal cusp facial, and you will leave the mesial facial intact. So now let's go to 3/4 crown. Okay, so here what we have is on the facial we took the distal and we did a prep. The emergence line would be fairly wide from the depth of the prep all the way to the facial. We still have the onlay type of margin up on top of the occlusion. The prep all the way goes around. The walls on the facial and the lingual have to be parallel with slight convergence to make sure that the prosthesis goes down in and out. The margins have to be very even, not only in depth but also in surface. They have to be smooth. Now the distal and the mesial are also convergent, so both of these are convergent. Facial and lingual are convergent. And on the distal
when you come up, on the mesial when you come up and you take the groove all the way up, now that is going to be divergent from the rest of the prep, so they should not be convergent. This part has to be divergent from the lingual wall. Here also, this has to be divergent from the distal wall, but in line when you look at it occlusally from this groove. Both of these have to be convergent when they come up from the occlusion. And of course, rest of the preps, every cusp is supposed to have at least 4 facets. And in case of a functional and non-functional bevel, you add 2 more. So each cusp will end up with 6 facets. Each wall should have 2 slopes in it, the gingival curvature and the occlusal curvature. So if you look at it right here, hypothetically, you have the line angle right there, then you have the central groove. Right here, there should be 2 separate planes. On here as well, you should have 3 aspects, and each one would have separate areas. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Then you have 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14. 14 each, times 4 at least on each cusp and each wall. That's how you come along. Now, not only do we do that, but when you're doing a metal restoration, you have the facial margin, but you also put an occlusal shoulder prep. That's called a truss. What I have not demonstrated here are the retentive grooves right here. One would go here otherwise, the other one would go on the mesial aspect, and the trusses will continue down into the groove to give a little bit more marginal strength to the metal that you're putting in there. We have come from a class 1 inlay to a distal occlusal inlay to an MOD inlay to an onlay to overlay to 3/4 of a crown, now 7/8. To continue on to complete crown, all you have to do is continue the prep into here and incorporate it, but we'll leave it at this. Hope this teaches you, and hope you can utilize this technique in your clinical practice or your examinations.